Hello, I'm Aaron McLear. I'm the U.S. Chair for Public Affairs at Edelman, and I want to welcome you all to the latest installment of Edelman's Divide Guide event series. It's part of our election programming where we offer analysis and insights to help you prepare for the election season and all of the political and policy ramifications that are going to come from it. As we know, 2020 has been an unprecedented year, and this is an unprecedented election cycle. Already 15 million people have voted, which is incredible. That's 10 times more than this time 4 years ago. 84% of voters can vote by mail this year. That's also an increase. Mail-in ballots in some states like Pennsylvania, they think are going to be 10 times more than they ever have been before. And these ballots are being processed and counted by over 10,000 jurisdictions in all 50 states, each with their own processes and rules. All of this in the face of a hyper-partisan political environment where members of both parties believe that issues like fraud and foreign interference will be the reason that their candidate does not win. Now, this could lead to, at best, a longer but very civil vote count, or at worst, a contested election that further divides a hyper-partisan country. So we're here today to explain the new dynamics and what we're seeing out in the marketplace and discuss what CEOs and brands can do about it. Before I introduce our panel, I want to encourage you to ask questions in the chat so we can cover exactly what you think would be most useful today. So with us today, our esteemed panel, my colleague, the U.S. COO at Edelman, Lisa Ross, who has been advising clients on these types of issues for a very long time. She's a former Clinton administration official, expert in these issues, and we're excited to have her join us today from Washington, D.C. From Portland, Oregon, a senior advisor to the Civic Alliance, something that I know a lot of you are members of. In fact, Edelman is a proud member of the Civic Alliance. Over 500 companies are members of Civic Alliance. Mr. Stephen Massey. And also in the nation's capital, if you've tuned into CNN or Meet the Press or picked up the Washington Post recently, you've seen this gentleman, my longtime friend, election expert, Ben Ginsberg from Washington, D.C. Thank you all for joining us. We very much appreciate it. Ben, I want to start with you just to sort of lay out what we're looking at this year. A lot of people are talking about how this year is different. And if you could just sort of just 101 explain how this year is different than past cycles. And you've talked a lot about how there's sort of 3 stages in this election season. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Thanks very much for having me, Aaron, and to Edelman for gathering this session, which I think we're all going to learn a great deal. So this election cycle is different for a number of reasons. First of all, it's a re-election of Donald Trump at a time when the country is more polarized than it's ever been. We're also in a time of pandemic that puts strain on the traditional ways we cast and count ballots. And thirdly, it's a natural progression for the country being quite as polarized as it is. One of the things that is overriding this election is the president's rhetoric. We've never had a president who has said our election system, sort of one of the bulwarks of our democracy, is fraudulent and produces rigged elections. And that also has put a lot of pressure on things. So as you look at the election, it's helpful to talk about it in 3 separate stages. The first is the pre-election. Aaron gave the statistics for it that show that interest in this election would appear to be greater than it's ever been. 138 million people voted in 2016. Estimates this time range between 150 and 160 million. That is a country that is more engaged. We've got to cast our ballots in a different way because of the pandemic. So there's a great increase in mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, they're called in some states. That puts a premium on this pre-election period. Some states will process those absentee ballots now. We're on election day. Others wait until afterwards. That gets into some of the post-election fun that we'll talk about. On election day, you need to be careful about and look at what's happening in polling places. I know a number of your clients and Stevens member companies are encouraging their employees to vote, providing paid time off so that people can volunteer as the very much needed election judges. And that's important to look at for election day. And then the post-election, should there not be an obvious winner on election day, you've read the parade of horribles and potential Armageddon events that could occur. If the election's not decided on election day, it's not obvious, then Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan will be the focus of the country because they count their absentee ballots late. And that stands to bring us a lot of challenges and intrigue.
Well, Ben, just staying with you, you and I have done a lot of political campaigns in the past, and we know election day, there's nothing to do but go to the movies. There's just all it is just a long day of waiting. But throughout the day, you'll see stories about election fraud, voter intimidation. You just mentioned that 3 states in particular, swing states, and by the way, a couple of those states have down ballot races that are also very important, will just take longer to count their ballots based on what's happening this year that's different than years past. Can you talk about how we can suss out what is actual fraud, intimidation versus what is just different this year? What is just sort of normal mistakes that happen in the process? I mentioned there's 10,000 jurisdictions that are doing this. Can you help us understand that day what we should look for that is shenanigans, and what should we look for that's just part of the process?
Very good question. One of the features of our system of government is a decentralized administration of elections. So no one will be surprised to hear that with 10,000 jurisdictions, there are sometimes some inconsistencies in the way the ballots are cast and counted. It is also a volunteer-driven system. Probably 1 million poll watchers in a normal year show up to help out those 10,500 jurisdictions. In a volunteer-driven system, there are mistakes. That's not fraud. And so it is incumbent on people who are volunteering in polling places, on members of the media, to sort out sort of mistakes or breakdowns in machines from actual fraud. Of course, one of the things that we should look at on election day is the president has said that elections are fraudulent. He has not produced any evidence to back up that claim yet. And it is a long way between making a national pronouncement that there's fraud and actually contesting an election on grounds of real fraud. So election day, if there is to be a contested election, in individual polling places, they will have to find instances of irregularity and fraud, get affidavits for it. The conduct of the elections in the polling places is something we should all be keeping our eyes on. And if there are instances of fraud that are found, that's what poll watchers are supposed to do. But wholesale challenges of voters to try and create a case that doesn't have really valid backing is something entirely different. But it will be played out state by state and maybe county by county, as opposed to a nationwide rhetorical barrage.
And I should point out, for those who don't know, Ben has been, as he wrote in the Washington Post, as a Republican election lawyer, has been looking for these instances of fraud for decades. And as he wrote, Ben, I'll let you articulate what you found or didn't find.
Well, I have spent 38 years on election days in polling places and running nationwide operations of Republican lawyers to look for fraud. And it is important to have poll watchers and election officials in all polling places to root out any evidence of fraud. But the hard truth for Republicans that we should admit to is that there is not a body of evidence to show systemic fraud. There are isolated incidents that have been found to be sure, and they should be prosecuted and rooted out. But this is the first time the President of the United States has said that our elections are fraudulent. So that makes all of this very, very different, because again, it makes sense in any election to have poll watchers who look for fraud. It is not a responsible position to say that there is fraud when the evidence is not there to back it up.
Thank you, Ben. And Lisa, just turning to you now that we've sort of established what we're looking at in the days after the election, what we could be looking at. You spend a lot of time advising big brands, big companies, C-suite officials on a number of issues. As you have throughout the year, we've seen COVID, the economic fallout from COVID, and the racial injustice movement over the summer. We've dealt with some very heavy and unprecedented times this year. We've established previously that business does have a role. But in this situation, could you talk a little bit about whether or not business has a role and what that role is?
Business, I think, in many ways has the most critical role. We always talk about our trust barometer and our data, but our data, when we released it this year, indicated that there is minimal trust in the four institutions that are the foundation of our civil society. Little trust in the competency of nonprofits, little trust in the competency or the morality of government and media, and who's left? Business. And so our research showed us very, very clearly. Ben talked about this is such a different year for the election. It is such a different year for the business community because in the absence of other leadership, they are expected to lead. One of our survey questions was, what is the role of the CEO? Is the CEO supposed to talk about civil issues, talk about social issues? 92% of everyone that we talked to, and this was globally, said it is the role, it is the responsibility of CEOs to talk about social issues, and civic engagement and appropriate elections could not be more of a more important civil issue. The other thing, I love the way Ben sort of talked about like these three phases, and what we've been saying to CEOs is, and to ourselves, quite frankly, as a company, how do you get your people ready for, so prepared for this really difficult election season? How do you survive the day of? And then regardless of the outcome, how do you recover? And so it's literally, so we've been advising on these are the things that you do in advance for your employees, your most important audience, for your customers, for your investors, for other stakeholders. What do you do that day of? And then regardless of the outcome, but particularly if it is a contested outcome, how do you drive business? How do you keep going under those circumstances? And so I actually think it's an exciting opportunity for business, again, to reinforce their role in society. And that is to lead, to continue business continuity, to speak up on issues that are important to them, and to be careful about politics. I think what we've all found is like the workplace is now the media. It's like the town square now. You can't control in the workplace how people feel about different issues, and we're all so polarized, but we also have different opinions. And so CEOs and business leaders have a particular responsibility and challenge now. How do you allow people to express themselves without alienating and offending and not getting in the way of business? And I think the smart companies and the smart CEOs are saying, let's have a conversation, because the way you think is valuable to us. The fact that you have a diversity of opinion is valuable to us, but there has to be a way to do it.
I think that the respect point is so important.
Yeah.
I think we certainly found that 4 years ago. I saw that I was at Uber, a tech company in San Francisco at the time, where you can imagine the current president was not a popular choice where I was sitting. And so we certainly saw that there, and I know that was a pretty big issue for a lot of companies. You mentioned that employees are such an important part of this. 92% of employees expect their CEO to step out on societal issues. We saw in the research we did on COVID earlier in the year that the most trusted communicator is, quote unquote, my employer, right? So we know there's a real role here. So as it relates to employees, which I think we can all agree is really the most important audience, I think, for CEOs to factor in. Yeah. Can you give some tangible advice on the types of things that CEOs can be thinking about now to prepare for that, so they're not flat-footed on November 4th and 5th and 6th when this is playing out? What are the types of things they should be thinking about now as it relates to employees to help prepare for that situation?
You said it. Preparation is the key to everything, right? And so we often say that you can avoid a crisis if you manage the issue. And so this is all about scenario planning. So this is like every single CEO, everyone in the C-suite should have a plan for, how do we take care of our employees leading up to the election? What are the things that you're going to do? Communication is key. So that's the first thing. So in your scenario planning, how often are you going to communicate? Who are going to be your communicators? Because the messenger is as important as the message. How do you align that to your mission, vision, and values? People are always nervous about like, oh, I don't want to say this, I don't want to say that. And I'm like, but you believe in things as a company, right? And so everything that you do should tie in. And so it's also like this empathy thing. I can't talk enough about the need to show empathy. This is like no other election season. We've been in a pandemic. People are hurting. People are struggling. People have died. A lot of people have died. People have lost their homes. They're worried about their livelihood. They're worried about educating their children. And so then on top of this, and so the CEO, in addition to communicating, has to communicate with empathy. I think we're seeing many CEOs, companies like our own, who are saying, look, take that day off. Civic engagement is so important, or take this certain number of hours off. And we can't go to the movie theaters anymore to wait out the election, but like, what do you do that day? And so employers have to play they have to be empathetic, they have to communicate, and they have to assure it's not business as usual, but it is business continuity. Regardless of what happens, we have a job to do. And I'm going to create an environment where you can execute on that job, but we do have a job to do. We have a business to run.
That's exactly right. Chief empathy officer, as we like to say with CEO, and as our own Sidney Roach often says, that special empathy for those who are disproportionately affected by COVID and the racial justice movement and other things we face this year. Lisa just hit on a number of things that companies are doing, Stephen, and this is something that your Alliance has been really focusing on over the last several months. And again, we're proud members here at Edelman. Can you talk a little bit about, just piggybacking off what Lisa said, about how CEOs are engaging in civic activities and are encouraging employees to engage civically as well? Probably more than we've ever seen before. Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in the marketplace right now? What other companies are doing that's particularly interesting, particularly good, and how that's sort of evolved the last couple of years? Because you just seem to be seeing much more of that since even the last cycle.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much to Edelman for inviting me to be here today. Thank you also for being a proud Civic Alliance member. The Civic Alliance was created this year as a space for the business community to come together in a nonpartisan way to really strengthen our democracy by encouraging participation. Really, the idea here is that a strong business is good for democracy, and an engaged business community can support our democracy by encouraging participation. So there are really exciting ways that companies are leaning in this year. And I think as we look back at 2020, despite all of the challenges that we've faced, I think this is the year that we're going to look back and be able to say, wow, that 2020 was the year that the business community really came together in a broad consensus that being engaged in civics and supporting employees and consumers, encouraging Americans to participate, that's good for democracy, and it's really good for business. And so we've seen companies engage in sort of 4 strategies. First is by creating and implementing voter-friendly workplace policies. And Aaron, you touched on that. Some companies are choosing to close on election day in order to allow their employees to go vote. Some have gone even on that to provide not only paid time off on election day, but encouraging their employees to be poll workers and paying them to do so. And just acknowledging 2 of our Civic Alliance members, Target and Old Navy, that are doing that. Another one of our Civic Alliance members has chosen to open late. So Best Buy store locations are going to be opening at noon local time in each of their communities to allow their employees to go vote. And Best Buy employs about 110,000 people. It's incredible, giving them that choice and that opportunity. McDonald's, another Civic Alliance member, they have 850,000 employees. Many of those employees are young Americans, many from communities of color. And they are recommending to franchise owners that they shorten shifts to 6 hours in order to allow time for their employees to vote. So voter-friendly workplace policies are a great step. Another way to really lean in this year is to engage your employees. And that can include lots of different forms, like sending out emails from the CEO to all employees, providing nonpartisan trusted voter tools to help employees register to vote and make a plan to vote and navigate what is an admittedly complex cycle. So that's step one. But many companies have gone well beyond that to organizing workshops. And I know I participate in so many town halls with companies all over the country to help educate and empower their employees. Third, I think we've seen companies really work to engage consumers. And what I think what's exciting about this year is that we are being bombarded. There's a surround sound from our most trusted brands and employers and even small businesses in our communities, encouraging us to vote, creating a culture where voting is celebrated and where every American is encouraged to participate in elections. And I'm old enough to remember back in the early mid 80s and early 90s when it was sort of MTV was the company that was out telling you to rock the vote. And now it's like companies across the country from, as I said, Best Buy, Target, McDonald's, Twitter, Facebook, all the social media apps. I mean, they're all encouraging and registering Americans to vote. All the professional sports leagues this year. I mean, let me tell you, these sports leagues are trying to run their organizations inside of a pandemic, which is really tough stuff. But every single day, their players are out, the teams are out encouraging Americans to vote. It's super impressive. And also, I think some companies are just getting really creative about how to engage their customers. I just want to acknowledge Zillow, a really great Civic Alliance member company. They've decided now to just integrate voter registration right in the Zillow app. So every time you rent or purchase a home through Zillow, updating your voter registration is just part of their tool now. Just really exciting. Finally, I just want to say that many companies have really stepped up to meet the unique challenges of the 2020 election. We're facing an unprecedented election, as Ben said at the top. We're trying to run a national election during a pandemic. And because elections are so decentralized in this country, that means that 10,000 jurisdictions are trying to figure this out. Well, companies are stepping up and supporting elections officials by helping to recruit poll workers, which we know is so important this year, and by donating PPE and offering safe spaces, empty offices, arenas, sports facilities, empty concert venues, making them available to poll workers. And so, this is the year where I really feel like lots of companies have stepped up. And I hope that this is just the beginning of really shifting corporate culture in America so that every American feels encouraged and supported to vote by the companies and brands they love and trust.
That's great. Thank you. And again, over 500 member companies in such a short amount of time. And to your point, the more civic engagement from the business community, the more that strengthens our democracy. Ben, turning back to you on something that has come up a lot in the coverage of how people are anticipating what might happen after the election is drawing on lessons from 2000. Now, if folks don't know, Ben was on the ground in Florida in 2000 during the recount, so he lived that. And I'm just curious from you, Ben, since that's being drawn upon so much this year, what's similar, what's different, what lessons can we learn? Where are we perhaps overstating how we've been through this before and it's going to be the same thing? Could you just talk a little bit about how that might relate to what we're seeing this year?
Sure. Florida, my Florida. Bush versus Gore was a incredibly close election in one state that actually ended up making the difference on who won the contest. That is a mathematically long shot. We've had 3 election contests in our 57 presidential elections. So I think to be realistic about it, the chances of it happening this time are 5.2%. But Florida was different from what's happening in 2020. 2020 is, we don't know how many close elections there will actually be. 2020 is much more about how ballots are cast in a pandemic and how they're counted. And are they counted fairly? And will there be a delay even beyond the Florida delays that took place? Remember, if this election comes down to the Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan trio of battleground states, because of relaxed deadlines they have on when absentee ballots can be received, it will be a week or 2 weeks after the election before those ballots can be counted. In Florida, we knew the Friday after the election, it was damn close, and that a recount would occur. You're not going to know that in those 3 states until well beyond that point. And so the question this time may well be, can a state that's undergoing a contest or a recount actually get its procedures completed by the safe harbor date of the Electoral College in December, on December 8th, or December 14th, when Electoral College slates actually meet in their state capitals, or even January 6th, when the U.S. House counts up and makes official the Electoral College vote. So I think that you have no idea right now, nor could you, whether we face a Florida recount situation. What we might face is overtime in elections, but it is going to be different than the way Florida was.
Well, that's helpful. We actually had a question from our friend Scott Stanzel, who we worked with in 2004, asking exactly that, trying to put you on the spot about a prediction about when this might be settled. But I think you sort of covered this, that if this goes, if it's close in the Electoral College, that this could be settled sometime in perhaps in December, mid-December, before or after they meet. Is that how you think about it?
Well, I actually think about it in terms of, if you look at history, it is most likely that we'll know a winner on election day. We can talk about the particular states that would be tells on election night or Wednesday morning. I think you have to acknowledge, because there are so many more absentee ballots, that it may take some states, including those 3, a longer time to be able to tabulate the ballots. But again, the chances of there being a recount close situation is historically 5.2%. So I think the odds favor knowing the winner, either on election day or within a week, 2 week, maybe 3 week period of it. And the chances of actually going to the Armageddon type situations are much less than that.
Okay. Well,
Aaron, if I can add, I love Ben talking about this, because I think we discovered when we got to know each other while Ben was in Florida looking over the election in the year 2000, I was a appointee waiting to find out what's going to happen. And so it's a reminder that we can never underestimate the human factor of that. Like what it feels for people. In this case, I was individually waiting to find out, am I going to continue in this job or not? You're not guaranteed from, but still, if the party was going to win, was I going to continue? But regardless of what happens this time, if it is a contested election, and because people are so anxious and so invested in this, it's hard to work under those circumstances. And so again, the role of the employer is to understand where the employee is in this space. What resources do they need? What support do they need? All the while understanding that we have a job to do, but there is a way to do that job, because you can't underestimate the weight and the burden of waiting feels when you're in that position. And God knows, we hope it doesn't happen again, but we have to, as we said before, prepare for it.
Well, going off of that, Lisa, a question we got from the audience as well is, what can CEOs be doing now to prepare for that situation? If this is contested, if this goes longer than we think, and understanding when you turn on one station, they're going to say one thing on
Right.
that Wednesday. You turn on another station, they're going to say a completely different thing, right? I think that we can know with some certainty that there's going to be some confusion and that it's going to be tough to kind of suss through what the media is saying on this. So given that that's going to be the dynamic and what you just said, what can CEOs be doing now to help prepare for taking care of and guiding employees during that period?
Nothing is simple, but there's like a small, sort of simple thing that they can do right now. Acknowledge it. Speak to your employees now and say, look, this is a challenging time. This may be a contested outcome. Voting right now is so incredibly important, but at least for the CEO, the Chief Empathy Officer, to articulate in whatever medium he or she is most comfortable and normally talks to their employees, but let them know, look, I'm thinking ahead. I am aware of how you may be feeling and I am preparing for that. You don't have to have an answer right now, but a large part of it is just acknowledging that this is going on. So a communication that goes out right now that says, we're how many days out? 20 something, 20.
19.
19, yeah.
Okay. All right, no sweating. So we're 19 days out. And so, and just in our communication says we're 19 days out. There are a number of scenarios. I want to assure you that we are preparing for the variety of scenarios that could occur. I want to assure you that this may be an exciting or a difficult or both time for you, and that we are supportive of you, but I'm thinking about it. Just acknowledge that it's on your screen.
Mm-hmm. I think another thing that we've been advising too is that there's ways of listening to employees now. We all, a lot of folks here on the call, you do that listening already through workplace or through other ways in which you do weekly town halls. So really being super sensitive, I think, right now to how they're feeling and what may pop up. I'm sorry, I think someone else wanted to jump in. Stephen, was that you?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Aaron, we're in this moment too where we really need to be encouraging participation. And one of the things that, I think all CEOs and companies can do in this moment is to continue to encourage their employees and their customers to participate in this process and to really communicate trust in our democracy. Like, our democracy was set up for this. And, we've been voting in this country for 250 years. And it's true that we're voting in an unprecedented moment, but we voted during 2 world wars. We voted through pandemics in the past. And there are many democracies around the world that have successfully held elections in 2020. We've learned from those experiences. And our elections officials are deeply committed workers who should be celebrated. They are working around the clock to make sure that this election can be safe for voters and trusted, and that results can be verified as quickly as possible. And so the Civic Alliance has put together kind of a guide for companies, and we've really leaned quite heavily on Edelman. So I just want to say thanks again for that, the contributions. But we put together this guide to help all companies kind of navigate the next few weeks. And in addition to some suggested language and some kind of core principles that we would offer to companies as they think about that kind of messaging, we've also put together what I think is a very helpful messaging filter. 5 questions, essentially, that any company, any CEO, any communications team would want to ask themselves from the perspective of the voter. And those 5 questions are: first, will this message make anyone feel intimidated to vote or like their vote won't matter? 2, will this message make it seem like the election results may not be valid? 3, will this message empower individual voters and ensure that their vote will make a difference? 4, will this message make me feel invested in the election process and democratic norms? And 5, will this message overwhelm me? And those questions, I think, are just really kind of helpful because there's a lot that we're all getting bombarded with right now in terms of messages about the election. And in some ways, we don't need to overcomplicate this. Employers have a vested interest in making sure that their employees have a voice in our democracy, that employees participate. Our democratic institutions are strong, and we should have faith in those institutions. And as employers, we want to be there to support our employees through these rough moments. And so I think, as you've said, being an empathy officer and really thinking about this as a way, in a way of support for employees, I think is super helpful.
I think that's a great framework, and having a framework and having you rooting yourself, centering yourself in your core mission and values, I think is always a good way to get through difficult questions like this. A question we got from the audience, which I think is, Lisa, I'd like to start with you, but would like others to weigh in as well. It's great. We should say we love democracy. You guys should vote. We've given you time off to vote. We've done all those things. But there's still, I think, a real vulnerability and a real concern that whatever I say in a heated political environment is going to upset half of my employees, half of my customers. And so, Lisa, starting with you, what kind of advice do you have for folks on the call here who are advising the C-suite or maybe in the C-suite that are attending here on what to say, how to say things, where you're making an impact. It's a meaningful thing to say, but you're doing it with a sensitivity of not upsetting half of your audience.
I was listening to Stephen and Ben talk, and I thought talking about voting, just the message of voting is actually a gift, because who disagrees with voting? Like that's a basic right. That's a basic responsibility. And by simply talking about voting, it actually gives some CEOs and some companies who don't want to talk about some of the other issues that we've been facing of racial equity, voter suppression, even that sort of thing. It's easier to almost talk about voting because there's nothing, you're not going to alienate 50% of anybody by talking about voting. You may alienate if you talk about Black Lives Matter. You may alienate if you talk about voter suppression. You will certainly alienate if you mention either of the candidates' names. And I have to say, in the 3 months that we've been really, really actively engaged in CEO counseling, I have never heard one person utter the name of either candidate because they know that that actually will alienate people. So to be political and to be civic are two different things. Politics at work, and we just saw some recent data that talked about people are like, I don't want to talk politics at work. But to be a citizen of the world, you absolutely do. And Stephen, I could not help but smile because it's real. Not all of us have been voting for 250 years.
That's right.
So there's a large swath of the American people who have not had the opportunity to vote for 250 years. And I think for those audiences, the concept of voting and for leadership and CEOs and for your employer to say vote is a really big and important deal.
Yeah, Lisa, one of the things that I have really learned in this election is the kind of the power of setting an example. And I think most of us are now working on Zoom, right? And so there's kind of those minutes right before everybody joins, right? And you kind of have this political or you kind of have a banter, right? And I was reminded on a call the other day, actually, that there's some political bias sometimes that happens in those situations because people are watching. And as leaders inside of companies, those moments before a call starts, the behavior, the conversation that happens, what would normally happen around a water cooler, those conversations make an impact. And just because you're sitting at a Bay Area company, you can't assume that everybody at your company has left-leaning values. And so I think that's just one thing, like being just really sensitive to and to that moment. Two, I really appreciate you saying that not everybody has been voting for 250 years. We've been holding elections that long in this country, but we know that this has been a long road and a difficult road. My family actually came here on a raft from Cuba in 1963. And my grandmother voted for the first time in the 2000 election when she got her citizenship. And I'm reminded every day that there are many stories of why voting matters to people. And there is a broad consensus in this country that voting is important. Voting is something that should unify us. It unifies Americans, and there's strong commitment in this country to democracy. And so while I don't think it's helpful to talk about candidates or policy issues at work, talking about why voting matters to you, that's a really powerful role that I think a CEO can play. I want to acknowledge one, the CEO of Under Armour. He is voting for the first time in 2020. He's a new U.S. citizen, and he stepped into this role as the CEO of Under Armour, and he said, hey, how can I get my company engaged in this election, and how can I participate as a voter for this first time? And it's just, every time I talk to the team in Under Armour, I hear his passion through them. And it's not a passion for politics, it's a passion for democracy.
And if I could, Aaron, one of the other points that CEOs, I think, can make in a safe way is that voter participation in the United States is shockingly low. If it gets above 60%, 62%, even in this election, which seems to be more energized than most, that still means that close to 40% of eligible voters are not participating. And so needing to vote is a virtue of the democracy that I think CEOs can urge in a safe way.
Yeah, the number, when you try to put a visual around the number of people who don't vote, in 2016, there were about 100 million Americans who didn't vote. That's more people who didn't vote than voted for either of the two candidates. And 100 million people, just to give you how to quantify that, that's the same size as the entire US television audience for the Super Bowl, the most watched television event in the country. That's how many people, eligible voters, didn't participate in 2016. And the Civic Alliance was created really to support not just voter engagement this year, but we're working toward what we're calling a civic moonshot to reach 80% voter turnout by 2028. And when we looked across the landscape of the different sectors that could really help get us there, I think the business community stands out as one of the most potentially supportive and transformative allies that could be engaged to help us get to that moonshot. And boy, wouldn't it be great if this country had a democracy and an electorate that reflected all Americans' values, all Americans' aspirations for the future. You know, what we've seen over the summer with all the kind of unrest and civil unrest, voting isn't that answer, but it's certainly part of the solution to making sure that all Americans feel like their voices are heard and that their values are reflected in our government and in our societies.
Lisa, just going back to you and piggybacking off of that comment, we've dealt with a lot of issues this year, and you've been at the forefront of advising clients on these issues. You know, not the least of which, and most importantly, was the racial justice movement over the summer and everything that came of that. You just touched on this, but do you see an intersectionality between that movement and the importance of that as that relates to civic engagement and what CEOs' role in both of those ought to be?
Absolutely. I mean, you cannot, particularly this year, separate out the two. And I said no one's talking about the candidates, nobody's saying the names, but there is a clear sense of racial equity on one side and less, not non-existent, but less support for racial equity. And so, of course, there's intersectionality. You know, we talked about, we have a history in this country of voter suppression. That's one of the things that people are protesting about. We have a history in this country of voter intimidation. And that's what people are protesting and marching about. And those numbers of people that did not participate last time, I think that there is an overwhelming number of, and an effort to get those people to participate this time. Now, not all of those people were people of color. They were people who just were dissatisfied or disenfranchised or felt disempowered. But I think an emerging message that has always been a part of our electorate is your vote counts. And I think that theme is really significant right now. And that is almost like the thread that's going through to a lot of these communities. Your vote counts. You can actually do something about everything that you are marching about this year. And as a friend of mine said, for all the protests that we have watched this year that have been diverse in terms of racial and ethnic makeup, age, political affiliation, geography, if all of those people march, if they vote, you've got a really interesting outcome this year.
Thank you, Lisa. You mentioned an important issue of voter suppression, voter intimidation. Ben, you've written on this subject, on the subject of voter intimidation and some things that concern you that you're seeing. I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of what you're seeing on that issue. And then Stephen and Lisa, I'd love after that to hear your thoughts on a CEO's role in protecting their employees if we see some of this civil unrest and protests and things like that some are concerned about. So Ben, I'll start with you and just expressing some of the concerns that you've written about. Well,
the truth is that both parties have embraced election day issues in the terms of Republicans see fraud and Democrats see voter suppression. And I don't mean to suggest a sort of equal weighting there, but both of those themes have become parts of each party's get out the vote message. And in a polarized time, those messages by both parties have taken on sort of very polarized, heated, rhetorical, not bringing the country together types of rhetoric. I think that's been weaponized in this election cycle by the president, who again doesn't have the evidence to back up his charge. But there is a bit of a problem with some of the litigation that the Democrats have brought in different states against legislation passed largely by Republican legislatures. So that, for example, the Democrats have sued in a number of states to extend the deadline for which absentee ballots can be received. That's going to delay the count. That's the Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin scenario. Now, if people are worried about chaos during the period when the winner of the election is not known, then the trade-off between expanding those receipt of ballot deadlines or having the ballots supposed to be done on election day comes at a price. And that price is being played out in some of the litigation that you do see around the country. And again, the litigation has the effect of causing confusion to voters. And confused voters are less likely to turn out to vote than voters who see the process as simple and straightforward. So there is a downside to the tactics on behalf of both parties.
And Lisa, just going back to you, and I promise we'll end on a more inspiring note, but just staying in the ugly part. If we do see civil unrest and we do see protests and we do see some passions that are manifesting themselves in some bad behavior in those days after the election, what's your advice to CEOs on their responsibility to protect their employees and to speak out if that's the case?
Aaron, we talked about the role of CEOs, but the way employees see it is my employer. And so it is the CEO in many cases, but in the absence of trust in core institutions that are the foundation of a civil society, nonprofits, media, and government, business has emerged. And within business, there is this very intimate personal relationship that we've seen in our research increase over the past 4 or 5 years of the employer-employee relationship. And so the employee looks to their employer and says, I expect you to guide me. I expect you to give me information. I expect you to advocate on my behalf. I expect you to speak out. And on this particular issue, when something goes wrong, there's an expectation that my employer is going to stand next to me. My employer is going to look around and speak up. My employer is going to be a part of an important conversation that is the security and the brilliance and the beauty of our democracy.
That's great. Thank you. Stephen, anything to add to that as far as if we have an ugly situation after the election that, what you have been advising CEOs to do in that situation?
Yeah, we've been working closely with the Dialogue Project, which is an organization that really helps kind of navigate periods of uncertainty and difficult communications. And they provided with a number of recommendations that I think are consistent with what the other speakers have said, really around not remaining silent, but really being in communication and to really serve as that chief empathy officer. Acknowledging the difficulty, and especially for big retailers that have lots of employees on the front lines working every day in already pretty difficult environments, having to deal with the politicization of mask wearing and difficult situations in stores. I was on the phone with a major airline earlier today, and the flight attendants who are dealing with just really challenging circumstances. And then you add an election, a contentious election on top of that. Just try to get in their shoes, acknowledge the bravery that so many frontline workers, especially our essential workers, are experiencing right now, and how this adds to it. And remember, our elections officials are the essential workers of our democracy. So I think that's something to keep in mind. Obviously, listening actively and modeling desired behavior, I think, is really helpful. Also, and finally, just to reiterate core values. I think, depending on how the situation plays out, and especially if there's any kind of civil unrest, it may be helpful to really reiterate company policies around social justice and diversity and inclusion and harassment and bullying and so on. So employees and customers really are reminded that your brand has committed to community, it's committed to respect in the workplace and respect with your customers and togetherness. And look, this has been a rough year. This has been a contentious election, but this country knows that it will move on. And right now, there's a lot of concern, I think, in the country about the election, but a large majority of Americans believe that our country needs to come together after the election, accept the results of the election, and move forward in a way that's unified. And I'm really hopeful that our business community can inspire that kind of togetherness heading into 2021 and beyond.
You keep bringing this back to inspiration, which I very much appreciate. I keep trying to get this ugly. You keep on a positive note. We have been robbed of our presidential debate tonight, or some would say blessed of not having a presidential debate tonight. So in the spirit of that, I would love for each of you to give closing comments. 60 seconds, don't interrupt each other, but just sort of last words of advice for folks here on the call on what they should be thinking about. Reiterate so maybe some of the highlights that you said earlier, but what do you want to leave this audience with? And Stephen, since you just wrapped up, anything you want to add to what you just said to start with?
Yeah, first, I just want to say thank you. Thank you to Edelman, and thanks to this team for giving us the opportunity to be here. I also want to acknowledge so many of the Civic Alliance member companies who are on today's call and those that aren't. I think one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic is because I have the good fortune of talking with companies every day. And there are democracy heroes working inside companies, coming up with really innovative strategies to engage and mobilize their employees to vote, empower their customers. I mean, really, the individuals that I'm working with and the companies that are part of Civic Alliance are truly incredible, and they're strengthening our democracy in ways that will last for a long time. And any company is welcome to join Civic Alliance. It's completely free to join. We have lots of upcoming events like this and tools and resources to help you navigate the next few weeks. So please, we'd love to have you. You can visit us at civicalliance.com, and we'd love to welcome you. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Stephen. And Ben, any closing thoughts for the audience here?
Sure, a couple. Well, first of all, thanks to you and Edelman for putting this on, and thanks for the interest amongst all the people who are on the call in this really important subject. Being involved and being able to explain this election process is really, really important. And I do think you can take the message to your employees that the strength of the U.S. democracy, the basic foundations of our electoral system, reside happily enough in the people who work on the local level. You should not think of this as some sort of nationwide drama playing out only by people you see on TV. In reality, now that we're at the stage where votes are actually being cast, this goes to people in your communities and all communities who give of their time and care about the process to cast ballots and then to count ballots. And that is an aggregation up. It is not an edict passed down. And so I take faith that this election, despite the difficulties we're facing, actually it's going to come out just fine because of the strength of the people on the local level who actually make elections work.
Well, to hear Ben Ginsberg say this is going to turn out just fine gives me a lot of comfort. So thank you for saying that. Lisa, closing thoughts from you.
Silence is not an option. We live in an activist society and an activist community, and you have to be engaged and you have to speak your truth. The strength of any solid economy is a strong democracy and an active and engaged and informed electorate. And this year hurts, but I think it's because we're growing. And I think that we will be better off as a result of it. And as my necklace says, vote. It's the last thing I have to say.
That's great. I think I've seen that on somebody else previously. That's a great message to end on. Thank you all, panelists, Mr. Stephen Massey in Portland, Oregon, Mr. Ben Ginsberg, and Ms. Lisa Ross in Washington, D.C. I'm Aaron McLear here in Seattle. And please stay tuned for further programming from the Edelman Public Affairs team. We put out an email called the Divide Guide each Friday that encompasses all of our insights, all of our analysis that we're putting out in the marketplace. You'll be able to watch this recording as well if you so please. Thank you again, panelists. Thank you again, audience. And as Lisa said, vote. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Aaron. Take care,
Thank you.
everyone.